If you ask the average D&D player what they know about the brutal world of Dark Sun, they might mention its dying ecosystem, rampant oligarchs, gladiator pits, cannibalistic halflings, or the fact that psionic powers are really commonplace. And when it comes to psionically gifted individuals, this doesn't just mean there are people with psionic powers, but also that there are a ton of psychic animals and monsters, which gives a lot of the stuff you encounter in Dark Sun a little bit of a brain spice, if you will. So when I tell you that our monster this week is a psionic jackal that forms a hive mind with its pack and eats the emotions of dying creatures, hopefully it doesn't come across as too crazy. The ZHACKAL was first printed in 1992 for AD&D 2nd Edition's monstrous compendium, Dark Sun Appendix, Terrors of the Desert. And while the artwork here is competent, it belies just how supernatural this creature is. At first glance, it just kinda looks like a jackal looming over a bone, which isn't inherently a bad design, but if it weren't for their name being Jackal with the J replaced by a ZH, you might not realize that this is indeed a creature capable of using psychic powers. Zhackals are small creatures who live in the desert, mostly inhabiting caves and rocky overhangs that can provide them with shelter from the heat and passing sandstorms. They live in packs that can vary pretty wildly in size, from just a few individuals to nearly 50, which are always led by the strongest member. These Zhackal packs all share a low-level psionic link that allows them to communicate with each other mentally across a distance of up to 500 feet. This means that within the hive-minded pack, each individual ostensibly knows anything that one other individual knows, which makes them extremely effective cooperators and highly coordinated when they need to be. They're carnivorous scavengers by nature, meaning that they rarely hunt down living prey, instead opting to feed themselves on the carcasses left behind by more dangerous predators, or by acting with patience. When they see a creature, usually a humanoid of some sort, that seems to be faltering on their journey across the desert, they don't typically close in for the kill, at least not right away. Instead, they stalk their prey and wait for it to collapse, only then closing in to finish off the target with their psionic powers before devouring the corpse. And while they most certainly do need to consume physical matter for survival, the thing that fuels their psionic abilities, and the thing that they crave above all else, is the psionic energy released by a dying creature. Their psionic attacks on the dying are not simply a means to finish off their meal, but rather a manifestation of them draining the psychic and emotional energy of that creature as they fall into despair. Basically, they eat people, and they eat their bad feelings. When it comes to combat, they are pretty skittish and will almost never choose to stay and fight if they don't have to. If the target, who they thought was on death's door, turns out to have a little bit more fight left in them than initially thought, they may choose to do battle for a few rounds, but once things start to turn ugly, they have absolutely no qualms about leaving. In order to get by in a world like Dark Sun, you kinda have to be a survivor, and Zhackals are nothing if not cunning and pragmatic when it comes to picking their battles. Zhackals would get a second printing, albeit many years later, in Dungeon Magazine issue 111. Kind of. Technically, they were printed in a Dark Sun bestiary, which was included with Polyhedral Magazine issue 170, and if you've never heard of Polyhedral Magazine, you're not alone. Polyhedral has a really weird publishing history, but the broad strokes are that it was started in 1981 by TSR, and then when Wizards of the Coast purchased TSR in 1997, it went on hiatus for a few months before coming back in a bi-monthly format until 2002, where the magazine was merged with Dragon Magazine, which you would think that meant the end for Polyhedral Magazine, and it would sort of make it like a column in Dungeon going forward, right? But no, it was still considered a separate magazine, which had its own cover, issue, and number. It was just attached to the back of Dungeon Magazine for a few years, which means things get very complicated, because while this monster is legally printed in issue 111 of Dungeon, issue 111 of Dungeon also includes issue 170 of Polyhedron. It's wild too, because you'll be flipping through the pages of Dungeon Magazine, and then suddenly there's a cover for a different magazine with its own issue number and table of contents. They literally just stapled a whole ass different magazine onto the back of an existing publication, and that's wild. So basically, issue 149 to 171 of Polyhedron are all part of issue 90 to 113 of Dungeon Magazine. Eventually, Polyhedron Magazine would just disappear. However, in 2005, it would kind of return as the name of an email newsletter put out by Wizards of the Coast, which were also numbered as issues 170 to 181, though they were never published in any form beyond these email newsletters, which I was unable to find anywhere, and are not archived on the Wizards website, so I'm pretty sure these 10 issues of Polyhedron, which apparently were mostly just reviews and product announcements, are now technically a form of lost media. So if you have emails in your inbox from WotC that date back to 2005, let me know. Anyways, the ZHACKAL appeared in the penultimate issue of Polyhedron, which was on the back half of Dungeon 111, and its inclusion here is kinda underwhelming. It does contain 3rd edition rules for the monster, but it completely cut their hive mind trait and relegates their lore into just a paragraph. There's also no artwork here to speak of, so the printing of this creature adds basically nothing and strips away one of their coolest features, and is therefore kind of meaningless. But it did prompt me to go down a bit of a rabbit hole in the whole Polyhedron magazine thing, so hopefully you at least found that interesting. Anyways, let's get into how this creature actually functions, what it can do, and how we might punch it up a bit for D&D 5th edition. This is a classic example of a creature that has a lot of neat little details and things going on, but kind of lacks that extra je ne sais quoi that might make it an awesome encounter. So the first thing I did was get some new artwork made for the thing because it hadn't had an art refresh for so long. I mean, the last time it had artwork, it was in black and white. So here we have a new take on the ZHACKAL from Tam that gives them some glowing eyes and an extra set of ears, which I love. This might not seem like a big deal, but by giving this creature a couple strange features, it does a great job of signaling to the players that something is up with this weird little guy. Then of course we had to convert the monster into 5th edition, which was pretty simple. They're only a CR1 creature, so their stat block isn't really complicated. Basically, they've got a bite attack and of course a trait that explains their mind link ability. Since the psionic spells they could use don't really exist in 5th edition, and there aren't any spells that replicate their effects, I just turned them into 2 traits, both of which are pretty fun in my opinion. The first is called Psionic Lash, and it functions as the ZHACKAL's primary mental attack that it uses to finish off dying creatures. The target of the attack has to make a charisma save, and if they fail, they take some psychic damage and gain a level of exhaustion. This is in place of a psionic power from 3rd edition called Ego Whip that drained charisma, so while not exactly the same, it felt like something more in line with the design of 5e and 5.5. Its second psionic action is called Cloud Mind, and this is a fun one. Basically, this ability allows the ZHACKAL to erase its presence from the mind of another creature, more or less making them invisible to that creature. What's cool about this ability though is that it doesn't just make them invisible, it makes it so that the target cannot perceive them at all in any way. As far as the target is concerned, they simply don't exist because their brain is not receiving information regarding the ZHACKAL's presence. And that's really important because that means it bypasses things like blind sight or true sight even, because while the target is technically seeing the ZHACKAL, they don't register its presence. This effect does end after a minute or if the ZHACKAL starts attacking the creature, but it's a really unique tool for stealth that I think will catch a lot of people off guard. The last thing on their sheet is a trait called Scavenger, which gives them advantage on attack rolls against creatures who are bloodied because they are primed to target those who are on death's door. That's not in the original stat block, but I felt like it was fitting and wanted to give them a little extra something. Speaking of things not in the original stat block, I also wanted to expand on what this creature is, so I made a whole separate stat block, which I simply just called the ZHACKAL Alpha. This is a CR5 version of the ZHACKAL, which does more or less the same kind of stuff, except its abilities are tuned to be a bit tougher. I also gave the Alpha resistance to psychic damage, and more or less the magic resistance trait, both of which it shares with any other ZHACKALs in its pack who are mind linked with the Alpha. The Alpha also has a reaction called Mental Feedback that allows it to cast Confusion on a target who causes damage to the ZHACKAL Alpha as a once per day defense mechanism. But I didn't stop there. Drawing some inspiration from the way a coven of hags shares spells with one another, I also came up with a small sidebar chart which I simply just called pack spells. The idea that a pack of ZHACKALs gets more psionically powerful the more members are mentally linked together was really interesting to me, and this is a way to gamify that somewhat. Depending on how many ZHACKALs are in a pack, they get access to a limited casting of several spells that grow in power as they grow in number. If the pack has 4 or more members, they can cast Sleep once per day. If there are 7 members, Confusion. 10 members lets them cast Fear. 15 members lets them cast Hypnotic Pattern, and 20 gives them 3 castings of Silence each day. If they manage to get a pack all the way up to 25 or more individuals, that gives them a single casting of Hallucinatory Terrain, and this is all entirely optional, of course, but I think it adds something really cool to the dynamic of this creature, making them much more dangerous in large groups. I could see them using something like Hallucinatory Terrain to create a mirage that lures in wayward travelers to their ultimate demise. Or maybe they use Silence to stop a thirsty traveler from calling out for help as a caravan passes by. Is that kind of messed up? Absolutely, but it's definitely the thing a creature like this would do. However, I didn't stop with that either, because I felt like as a group of monstrosities that inhabits a specific layer, they should have some layer traits. So I gave them rules for having a layer that gives a couple area effects that are all in line with their whole deal. Mental Drain makes it so that you have to make a charisma save if you long rest within a mile of their lair, reverting your long rest into a short rest if you fail. And Psychic Vacuum makes it so that creatures within a mile of the lair also have disadvantage on death saves. These are both meant to act as effects which only trigger against targets who get a pretty close distance to their lair, acting as a sort of deterrent for anyone who might be curious. All in all, I do think these changes and additions add a little spice to the ZHACKAL, and hopefully you do too, because there are just so many different ways you can use these guys at the game table. While any monster can be a random encounter with a ZHACKAL can appear in so many ways. They might be stalking the party through the desert, waiting for them to start slipping into exhaustion like vultures circling a dying traveler. Or they might be totally desperate and hungry, attacking the party with an uncharacteristic savagery, which is a great way to communicate to the players that resources here are getting scarce and maybe something else is going on. Or the party might come across a wounded NPC who is in the midst of fighting for survival against a pack of Zhackals. Will they intervene to help the lone traveler, or leave him to his fate? Or perhaps they stumble into the lair of a ZHACKAL alpha and the members of its pack, which is certain to end in at least a bit of resistance before the creatures scamper off. ZHACKALs can also thrive in urban environments where they are constantly surrounded by dying mortals. If there's a plague or something going around, even better, but just generally speaking, in a major urban center, there are bound to be people on death's door somewhere in the city at pretty much any given time. By using their ability to hide themselves from perception, they can be hyper-elusive creatures when they need to be, which means they can move through a city with ease. So perhaps the party is dealing with a weirdly high mortality rate attached to some seemingly benign illness. People are getting sick with something that should be like a common cold, but instead of recovering after a few days, they wind up dying, and it's because some Zhackals have made a lair nearby in the city. The Zhackals are just having a grand old time feasting on the steady supply of mental energy, which just so happens to be pushing all of these mortals to an early grave. As CR1 creatures, a base ZHACKAL may also appear as a familiar option for an NPC character or even a warlock with a Pact of the Chain feature if you feel like providing that option for one of your players. This plays especially well if you have a character at your table who's a great old one warlock and has decided to lean into the psionic theming of their abilities. In the case of an NPC, a ZHACKAL might be a familiar for anyone who works in some kind of field that is adjacent to regular encounters with death. A doctor who seems to lose many of their patients, the owner of a fighting arena, or even just a belligerent guard captain can all make for great NPC masters of a ZHACKAL familiar. But no matter how you choose to use this creature, as always, linked in the description down below is my 5th edition conversion of this monster, which is free for you to use however you see fit. Both stat blocks, the sidebar chart with all of their pack spells and their lore and everything is all there. However, if you are one of my lovely patrons over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon page, you can get the high-res PDF version of this creature, which contains all the same game information, but is my way of saying thank you to everyone who throws me a few bucks every month, so I get to keep on doing what I'm doing here. Speaking of which, our random patron of the week this week is Alex Gavris. Thank you so much, Alex Gavris, for your patronage, and ultimately, thank you for watching. As always, if there's a monster you'd like to see show up in a future episode of Monster of the Week, let me know in the comments down below, or in the Dungeon Dad Discord server, which is also linked in the description down below. And maybe he'll show up at some point in the future. I don't know. I don't have psionic powers. I can't see the future. Also, if you check in the description down below, you'll find the Dungeon Dad merch store, which contains all kinds of Dungeon Dad merch, which is a great way for you to support me. And you get a cool t-shirt, or maybe an adventure. I don't know, it depends on what you buy. That's how commerce works, so I'm told. Also, just one quick shout out to Gamescom Canada. I'm gonna be there this year. I'm gonna be running some games. So if you want to go play D&D with me, or if you're just gonna be there and you want to say hi, I'm going to be doing events. I'm going to be walking around and buying a bunch of stuff that I don't think I'll be able to fit in my suitcase on the way home. So that is a thing that you know now. I'll leave a link to the games I'm going to be running in the description down below as well. So if you happen to be going to Gamescom Canada this year and you want to check that out, that's where you can do that. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Till then.